Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. Where are you listening from tonight? The Midwest, the South, or perhaps some quiet corner of the countryside? Wherever you may be, let's settle in and listen to this story together. Tonight, we are traveling to a place where the earth itself becomes a blanket. We are going back to the year 874 to the stark frozen beauty of Iceland, to discover how the Vikings built homes not on the ground, but within it. This is the story of the turf house, a sanctuary carved from the land to survive the long, dark winter. If you enjoy these quiet escapes into the past, please do click the like button to let me know and subscribe if you haven't already. It truly helps our community grow. Now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the modern world fade away. Adjust your pillow. Close your eyes. And imagine you are stepping into the cold, crisp air of the North Atlantic. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, back to a time when home meant something different entirely. Picture, if you will, the North Atlantic in the year 874. But before we arrive, there empty your mind of everything you think you know. Not the romantic vision of dragon ships with their carved prows cutting through silver waves. Not the Hollywood sagas with their torchlit feasts and furred cloaks billowing in theatrical winds. Not the golden mead halls echoing with poetry and the clash of drinking horns. Forget those images entirely. Sweep them away like morning fog. The truth was colder, harsher, more beautiful in its honesty, but beautiful in the way that a knife blade is beautiful. Sharp, unforgiving, functional. We're diving into how Vikings built underground turf houses to survive brutal winters that would have killed them in a single night had they not learned to think differently about shelter itself. This is the story of the turf house, the most ingenious dwelling you've probably never heard of. A dwelling that didn't rise toward the sky, but descended into the earth. That didn't announce itself, but vanished into hillsides. That became in time almost indistinguishable from the land that birthed it. Let me paint you the world they found. Close your eyes for a moment and see it with me. The North Atlantic stretches in every direction, grey meeting, grey where water touches sky. The horizon line blurs uncertain, as if the world itself hasn't quite decided where ocean ends and heaven begins. This is not the welcoming blue of Mediterranean waters. This is cold, incarnate, moving, breathing alive, with currents that flow from the Arctic carrying ice, and the memory of ice even in summer months. Above the sky hangs low, pressing down like a weight. Clouds move in layers at different heights, some so close you feel you could reach up and touch their bellies. The light that filters through is diffuse, shadowless, turning everything into shades of grey and black, and that peculiar shade of green that only exists at the edge of the world. It's a light that makes distances deceptive. Mountains that seem an hour's walk away are actually a day's journey. The air itself is so clear, so unpolluted by any human presence, that your eyes haven't yet learned to calibrate depth. And then there's the wind. Always the wind. It doesn't gust and calm like continental wind. It flows constant as a river pressing against you with physical insistence. Sometimes it comes from the southwest, carrying the ocean's moisture, leaving salt crystals on your skin and clothes. Sometimes from the north, descending from the glaciers so cold it makes your teeth ache. Sometimes from the east, having traveled across hundreds of miles of volcanic desert bone. Dry and abrasive, carrying black sand that stings exposed skin. This wind has shaped everything. The grass grows in waves, permanent ripples frozen into the landscape, all bending the same direction, like a congregation bowing towards some distant altar. The few shrubs that exist are twisted into tortured shapes, their branches growing only leeward, reaching away from the wind's assault. Even the clouds move in streams, and rivers flowing around invisible obstacles, creating patterns that repeat day after day as reliably as tides. The landscape itself spreads in every direction without the comfort of human scale. In Norway, valleys contained you. Mountains rose close on either side, creating boundaries and defining space. Here space refuses definition. The land rolls away in gentle swells, deceptive in their smoothness, stretching to horizons that seem impossibly distant. The volcanic rock that underlies everything erupts through the thin soil in ridges and formations, black against the green, creating a stark geometry that feels alien, almost lunar. To the north, if you turn and face that direction, glaciers crown the mountains like irregular white teeth. These are not the neat alpine glaciers of southern regions. These are vast ice sheets, rivers of frozen water, hundreds of meters, thick blue-white in their depths, grinding slowly downward under their own weight. On clear days, you can see where they carve into the ocean, creating icebergs that drift south on currents older than human memory. The glaciers breathe cold across the land, a steady exhalation that never stops, never warms, keeping even summer from becoming truly gentle. To the south, the ocean spreads its dominion. Not a friendly ocean, not inviting blue waters lapping at sandy beaches. This ocean is working water rough and cold and full of purpose. Waves build in the deep Atlantic, march toward shore in ordered ranks, then explode against the black volcanic coast in eruptions of white foam. The sound carries for miles. Even inland, even sheltered in valleys, you hear it, a constant low thunder that becomes the baseline against which all other sounds are measured. It's the sound of violence endlessly repeated, patient and methodical, the ocean slowly grinding the land into submission. Between ocean and glacier lies the habitable zone such as it is. Green grass covers the lowlands, thick and lush from abundant rain, but it's a green unlike the soft meadows of home. This green is darker, more intense, almost aggressive in its vitality. The grass grows in tussocks, creating an uneven surface that makes walking treacherous. Between the tussocks, black sand and volcanic soil show through. In places, the lava itself is barely covered. Jagged formations of rock that tore through the earth, perhaps centuries ago, perhaps mere decades, cooled and frozen in mid-flow, their surfaces sharp enough to shred leather boots in a day's walking. And across all of this, in every direction, the same stark absence. No trees. Your eye searches automatically for vertical elements, for the familiar silhouettes of oak or ash or pine. It finds nothing. The tallest vegetation barely reaches your waist. Most stays ankle-high, hugging the earth, as if afraid to rise higher, as if the wind has taught every living thing that prominence equals vulnerability. This absence creates a psychological effect that's difficult to describe to anyone who's never experienced it. Without trees, there's no shelter from sight. You can see for miles in every direction. Everything is exposed, visible, available to the wind and weather, and any eye that cares to look. Privacy becomes impossible. The landscape doesn't just surround you, it observes you. It knows you're here. Here's what most people don't realize, what can't truly be understood until you've stood on those shores feeling it in your body. When Norse settlers first stepped from their longships in 874, when their boots first touched volcanic sand, they faced an immediate crisis that went deeper than logistics or weather. They faced the collapse of their entire understanding of what landscape could be. These were people from Norway, from Denmark, from the green coast of Sweden. People who'd grown up surrounded by forests so thick you could walk for days in perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. People whose homes were made from the trees that grew within sight of their doors. People whose entire material culture, from ships to houses to tools to fuel, depended on timber as surely as modern life depends on electricity. The land they'd claimed offered almost no trees. None of the straight, tall trunks suitable for construction. None of the thick branches for firewood. None of the familiar vertical architecture that had defined human habitation in the north for as long as memory extended. Just this endless volcanic rock, this scrubby grass, and a wind that never truly stopped, that pressed and probed and searched constantly for weakness. Their traditional Norwegian longhouses required massive timber frames, 20, 30, sometimes 40 beams, each one a whole tree carefully selected and shaped, walls of vertical planks, roof supports strong enough to hold weighted thatch or turf. These structures were an announcement, a statement: humans live here, humans have mastered this space. But Iceland had betrayed them with its treeless horizons. The island offered grass and stone and sky and nothing else. It was a landscape of subtraction, of absence of everything that wasn't there. You probably wouldn't last 3 days if you'd arrived on those shores with them. Not because you lack courage, not because you're soft or unprepared, but because the cold there doesn't announce itself the way cold does in familiar places. It doesn't blast you with Arctic winds or freeze you with sudden storms. Instead, it simply moves in silent and patient through every gap in clothing, every crack in a hastily built shelter, every moment of hesitation or doubt. It's a seeping cold, a penetrating cold that works its way into joints and lungs, and eventually into thought itself, making decisions difficult, making hope feel like foolishness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious about the quiet corners of the world where these stories find their listeners. The land has stripped away the illusion of dominance, leaving only the vast horizontal truth of the cold. There is no shelter in the sky, so we must look elsewhere. Let us move now from the endless horizon down to the specific shivering reality of the first campsite, where the real work of adaptation begins. Sometimes survival means surrender. Sometimes strength means bending. Sometimes the only way to endure brutal winters is to stop fighting the land and start listening to it. We begin not with construction, but with cold. Not with triumph, but with terror. Not with answers, but with the raw, desperate question that drove everything that followed. How do we survive this? It's been 3 weeks since the longship landed. 3 weeks since that first glimpse of Iceland's black shores. The year is 874 late summer by the calendar, though you'd never know it from the temperature. The reality of this place has settled into your bones now, quite literally. The cold here operates differently than any cold you've known. In Norway, winter came with warning. You could feel it approaching, prepare for it, brace yourself. Here the cold is always present, woven into the very fabric of the air. Even now, in what passes for the warm season, You wake each morning to find frost on the canvas of your temporary shelter. You look to the leader of your small band for guidance. His name is Thorstein. He is not a famous chieftain. His name will not survive in the great sagas of kings and warriors. But here on this edge of the world, he is the most important man alive. He is an elder who has survived winters in the Shetland and Orkney Islands, places where trees are scarce and the wind is a living thing. While the younger men look at this barren rock and despair, Thorstein looks at the ground and sees a fortress. Your encampment sits on a gentle slope facing southeast, chosen because Thorstein insisted on it. The morning sun, when it appears through the frequent fog, strikes this spot first. Behind you rises a low ridge of volcanic rock, black and jagged, offering some protection from the north winds. Before you, the land falls away toward a small stream that rushes over stone's glacier melt, making its way to the sea. This stream is why you're here. Water is survival. But everything else about this location speaks of absence rather than abundance. Stand at the edge of camp and turn slowly, taking in the full circle of your new world. To the north, those dark ridges marching toward mountains whose peaks disappear into cloud. To the east and west, rolling terrain, covered in that strange scrubby grass, broken by patches of black sand and scattered boulders. To the south, the ocean, grey and restless, the same ocean you crossed, but now feeling less like a highway and more like a barrier separating you from everything familiar. No trees. That fact hasn't stopped shocking you. Your eyes keep searching for the vertical lines of trunks, the horizontal spread of branches. They find nothing. The tallest vegetation is a twisted willow bush, perhaps waist-high, growing in a sheltered depression where the wind can't quite reach it. Everything else hugs the ground as if trying to hide. The grass itself is unlike Norwegian grass. Thicker, tougher its roots penetrating deep into the soil. When you walk across it, your feet sink slightly, the ground springy rather than solid. It's like walking on a living carpet, one that's been growing undisturbed for longer than anyone can calculate. Thorstein has been teaching you to read this landscape, to see what it offers, rather than mourning what it lacks. That springy grass is turf. He explains the foundation of everything you'll build. The volcanic rock, though hard to work, splits along natural plains. The stream provides not just water, but power for a small mill eventually. The wind that seems so hostile will thresh grain, will dry fish, will serve you if you learn to work with it instead of against it. But understanding these gifts intellectually and feeling them in your body are different things entirely. Your hands are already changing. The skin has thickened, developing calluses in new places from tools you'd rarely used in Norway. Your back aches constantly from the digging, from bending, to cut turf, from carrying stones for foundations. Your lungs burn from breathing air that never seems to warm fully, that carries moisture from the sea, and that makes every breath feel slightly labored. The livestock are suffering too. The sheep huddled together in groups, their wool already growing thick in response to the cold. The 2 cows you brought look miserable, their Norwegian breeding unprepared for this harsh climate. One goat died in the 2nd week, simply gave up, refused to eat, lay down and didn't rise again. You butchered it for meat, but the loss weighs on everyone. Each animal is precious, irreplaceable. There are no neighbors to buy or trade with. What you brought is all you have. Your children have stopped asking when you're going home. They've begun to understand with that stark clarity children sometimes possess that this is home now. There is no going back. The ship that brought you has already departed, returning to Norway for another load of settlers. It might return next summer. It might not. Either way, you'll still be here, having survived or having died. The nights are when the reality becomes most acute. The canvas shelters, even when reinforced with stones and weighted against the wind, provide minimal protection. The cold seeps up from the ground, penetrates from the sides, descends from above. You've learned to sleep in every layer you own, wrapped in wool and leather, pressed against your family for warmth. The children sleep between the adults, the youngest in the center where it's warmest. Sleep itself comes in the fragments. The wind makes the canvas snap and shudder. Strange sounds carry across the landscape, birds you can't identify, the rush of water over rocks. Occasionally, the distant crack of ice shifting on the mountains. Every sound pulls you toward wakefulness, your body still on alert, not yet trusting this place. And when you do sleep, you dream of forests, of walking beneath oak branches, of the play of sunlight through leaves, of the particular quiet that only a forest creates, that soft absorption of sound. You wake from these dreams to canvas and wind and volcanic rock, and the grief of it sits heavy in your chest. But Thorstein won't let anyone wallow. Each morning, he has everyone up and working. The turf cutting has begun in earnest. You've learned the technique now, how to slide the long blade through the root mat at just the right depth, how to lift the blocks without breaking them, how to stack them to dry slightly before building. Your pile of cut turf grows daily, hundreds of blocks drying in the wind. The foundation pits have been dug for 3 houses, not one large hall as you'd build in Norway, but 3 smaller structures. This is practical. Smaller buildings are easier to heat, faster to construct with limited materials. And if one fails, if the design proves inadequate, you'll learn without losing everything. The pits themselves reveal more about this strange soil. Dig down through the turf layer and you find volcanic ash layers of it, marking ancient eruptions. Below that, more ash, darker. The geology here is young, violent, still settling. This island is being born even as you try to make it home. The mountains smoke occasionally. Earth tremors shake the ground every few weeks. Nothing serious yet, but reminders that the land itself is restless. The foundation stones are being fitted now, flat pieces of basalt carefully positioned to create a level floor. This work requires patience and precision. Each stone must be tested, adjusted, sometimes replaced. The floor will be where you sleep, where you prepare food, where you live. It must be right. And as the foundations take shape, as the first courses of turf are laid, something shifts in how you see this place. The house is rising from the earth itself, not imposed upon the landscape, but emerging from it as if the land has decided to offer shelter of its own accord. The walls grow thick, much thicker than you'd expected, Thorstein insists. The thicker the wall, the warmer the house. 1 meter, even 2 meters of turf. It seems excessive until you remember the wind, the cold, the long darkness of winter still ahead. This is your new reality, not the adventure you might have imagined when you first heard about Iceland, not a temporary hardship before establishing something like what you left behind. This is fundamentally different, requiring fundamental change. You must learn to see shelter in grass warmth, in earth home, in a hole dug into the ground. The sun drops toward the horizon and the temperature falls with it. Always this transition catches you off guard, how quickly warmth such as it is bleeds away. You gather with the others around the cooking fire, one of three that burn constantly. The fire consumes driftwood scavenged from the beach, precious fuel that must be rationed carefully. Tonight's meal is porridge barley cooked with water and a bit of seal fat for richness. The seal was found dead on the beach 2 days ago, already scavenged by birds, but with enough meat and fat remaining to harvest. You've learned not to be particular. Food is food. Waste is unthinkable. As darkness settles, Thorstein speaks about the building plan. 2 more weeks of good weather, possibly 3. The turf cutting must be finished before the autumn rains begin in earnest. The roofs must be completed, the doors fitted. Everything must be ready before the first snow. His words carry no drama. This isn't a motivational speech. It's a simple statement of what must happen for survival. Everyone listens, nods, understands. The work will get done because it must. There is no alternative. You lie down in your canvas shelter for another uncomfortable night, your wife beside you. Children between you, the familiar arrangement that provides the only real warmth. But tonight, for the first time, you can imagine something different. You can picture the turf house complete, can imagine stepping through its low door into darkness and stillness, into earth-held warmth. It's not a large dream, not grand, just the simple hope of being truly warm again, truly sheltered. That hope is enough. It has to be. Because tomorrow brings more digging, more turf, cutting more stones to fit. The work of transforming this hostile landscape into home continues. And you will continue with it, because you've already made the choice that cannot be unmade. You've come too far to turn back. This is where you'll survive or die. This is where your children will grow up or won't. This black volcanic island with its endless wind and absent trees. This is home now, and you will make it work. The psychological barrier is finally broken. You have accepted that to live here, you must cease to be a stranger and become part of the ground itself. The decision is made. Now the hands must learn what the mind has finally accepted. It is time to pick up the blade and master the physics of the earth. The next morning begins with instruction. Thorstein gathers everyone and demonstrates how to cut turf. This is not simple work. It requires technique, precision, respect for the material itself. You need a special blade, he explains. Long, thin, extremely sharp. The tool they develop will eventually be called a torfknife, a turf knife with a blade as long as your forearm. It must cut cleanly through the root mat without tearing, creating blocks that will hold together for decades. Watch how he works. He marks out a rectangular section of ground about the length of your forearm and half as wide. Then he cuts vertically down through the turf to a depth of 2 handspans. The blade slides through roots that have been growing and dying and interlacing for hundreds of years. When he lifts the block free, it weighs as much as a sack of grain and holds together perfectly a living brick. The beauty of turf, he says, lies in its structure. Look closely at a cross-section. You'll see layers. The top layer is living grass green, even in winter roots reaching downward. Below that, compressed dead grass from previous years, partially decomposed, but still fibrous. And at the bottom, the densest layer where roots have matted together into something almost like felt. This structure creates millions of tiny air pockets, and air when trapped in small spaces is one of nature's finest insulators. Each cell of dead plant matter holds a bubble of air. Multiply this by millions, and you have a wall that breathes but doesn't leak heat. A barrier that maintains temperature differentials that would be impossible with wood or stone alone. The physics are elegant. Heat moves through materials in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Turf defeats all three. Conduction requires material that conducts heat, typically dense materials where molecules are tightly packed. Turf, with its countless air pockets, interrupts molecular chains. Heat trying to conduct through turf encounters, air gap after air gap. It slows. It stops. Convection requires air movement. But the air trapped in turf is trapped, held prisoner by the root structure. It cannot circulate, cannot carry heat away. And radiation, the way heat simply radiates from a warm surface toward a cold one, is interrupted by the sheer thickness of the walls. A typical turf house will have walls between 1 and 2 meters thick. Heat, radiating outward from the interior, simply cannot make the journey through all that mass before it dissipates entirely. The numbers tell the story. Modern researchers have measured surviving turf houses and found that with a modest fire burning in the hearth, interior temperatures can reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, outside the temperature might be 20 below zero. That's a 40-degree difference, maintained by nothing but grass and root and air. Compare this to a traditional wooden longhouse. Wood is a decent insulator, better than stone, but nowhere near as effective as turf. A wooden wall might be 5 to 10 centimeters thick. Even with gaps stuffed with moss, even with tapestries hung inside to create dead airspace, a wooden house in Icelandic winter would require enormous fires burning constantly. You'd burn through your entire fuel supply in weeks, then freeze. Turf changes the equation. A turf house is thermally independent. Once warmed, it stays warm. It becomes what engineers call a thermal battery, storing heat during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. But first, you have to build it. And the method developed by those first settlers reveals a sophistication that scholars are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The process begins with site selection. You don't build just anywhere. You look for a gentle slope facing south or southeast, where the low winter sun will strike the entrance. You want natural drainage so groundwater won't pool beneath your floor. You want some protection from the prevailing wind, perhaps a low ridge to the north. And you want access to a water source, though not so close that spring floods will threaten your walls. Once the site is chosen, you dig. Not deep, perhaps only a meter down, but enough to set the house partially below grade. This serves multiple purposes. The earth itself provides insulation. Ground temperature at depth remains fairly constant year-round, warmer than the air in winter, cooler in summer. By descending into the ground, you're tapping into that thermal stability. You're also reducing wind exposure. Above ground, wind strips heat from any surface it touches. Below ground, you're protected. The wind passes overhead while you rest in calm. The foundation is laid with flat stones carefully fitted to create a level floor. This stone floor will become crucial to the heating system, but that comes later. For now, it's enough to know that stone once heated holds that heat for hours. Then comes the framework. This is where the precious driftwood earns its place. You'll need vertical posts at the corners and along the walls. You'll need horizontal beams to support the roof. But you won't waste a single piece. Every timber is measured, selected, used with the care of a craftsman working with gold. here's a secret most people miss. The driftwood that washes up on Icelandic shores comes from thousands of miles away. It begins as trees in the vast Siberian taiga forests, so immense they stretch across 11 time zones. When storms knock trees into rivers like the Lena or the Ob, they're carried north into the Arctic Ocean. There, they freeze into the sea ice, and the ice drifts caught in currents that circle the Arctic basin. Scientists estimate this silent journey covers over 2,500 miles, roughly 4,000 kilometers, and takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to complete. This journey transforms the wood. Salt water preserves it. Freezing prevents rot. By the time a log washes ashore, it might be harder than freshly cut timber seasoned by years of cold and salt. The Vikings recognized this wood as a gift from the sea gods, and they treated it accordingly. Every beam is precious because replacement is uncertain. You cannot order more lumber. You cannot cut it from a nearby forest. You can only wait for the next storm and hope the currents are generous. So you build with intention. You use half as much wood as you would in Norway, and you engineer the structure to compensate. The walls rise not from wood, but from turf. Block by block, they're stacked in a pattern called herringbone, each block tilted slightly inward so that gravity presses the stack together rather than pulling it apart. Consider the sheer scale of this labor. To build even a modest chieftain's longhouse required stripping the turf from an area as large as 3 soccer fields. A single dwelling could contain over 15,000 individual blocks of earth, each one cut, carried, and stacked by hand. This is crucial. A vertical stack of turf would slowly slump outward under its own weight. But a tilted stack where each block leans inward at about 15 degrees creates compression. The weight of upper blocks forces lower blocks more tightly together. The structure actually gets stronger as it rises. And here's where the living quality of turf becomes essential. As the blocks settle into place, their root systems don't die. They continue growing. Roots from one block penetrate into the blocks above and below. Within weeks, what began as separate pieces becomes a unified mat. Within months, it's virtually impossible to distinguish individual blocks. The wall has become a single organism, bound together by living tissue. The exterior face of the wall is carefully shaped to shed water. Rain is the enemy of turf architecture. If water penetrates and pools, the turf will rot from within. So the outer face is trimmed smooth and slanted slightly to encourage drainage. Some builders add a thin layer of birch bark as a moisture barrier, though bark is even rarer than timber and reserved for the most critical areas. The roof presents a special challenge. It must be supported insulated and completely waterproof. The solution is layers. First, horizontal beams span from wall to wall, spaced no more than a meter apart. On these rest shorter poles, laid perpendicular, creating a grid. On the grid goes birch bark or woven willow, anything that will keep turf from sifting through. And on that goes turf, thick layers of it, sometimes a meter deep, laid with the grass side up so the living roots can bind it all together. A finished roof is spectacular. Within weeks, the grass grows lush. Wildflowers bloom. From a distance, especially from behind, a turf house disappears entirely into the landscape. It looks like a small hill, a natural feature of the terrain. Only the door and the smoke hole give it away as human habitation. Stand back and look at it. This structure is more than just a house. It stands as a silent testament to human adaptability. Faced with an environment that offered almost nothing, no standing timber, no stones suitable for great halls, no metal, no surplus of any kind, the Norse made do. They turned the very grass beneath their boots into walls. They harnessed invisible ocean currents to deliver timber from forests they would never see. They dug into the frozen ground and forced it to become a shelter. And in doing so, they managed to reverse their fortunes. They didn't just survive the winter, they thrived within it. Now we arrive at the moment you've been waiting for, whether you knew it or not. The moment when the door closes behind you and you step from the harsh exterior world into the sanctuary within. The door itself is worth noting. It's made from precious timber, usually driftwood that's been painstakingly shaped and smoothed. It's smaller than you'd expect, deliberately low, so that anyone entering must duck, must adopt a posture of humility before crossing the threshold. This isn't just tradition. A small door means less heat loss. Every time someone enters or leaves, cold air rushes in. The smaller the opening, the less disruption to the carefully maintained interior atmosphere. The door fits tightly into its frame, sealed around the edges with wool or moss to eliminate drafts. Some doors have an additional feature, a sort of antechamber or short tunnel that creates an airlock effect. You pass through two doors with a small space between them, ensuring that cold and warm air never mix directly. Push the door open and step inside. The first thing that strikes you is the darkness. After the wide white light of outdoors, this interior seems almost completely black. Your eyes need time to adjust, time to find the sources of illumination. The glowing hearth, perhaps a small flame from a seal oil lamp, thin shafts of daylight slanting through the smoke hole in the roof. The second thing is the silence. The wind that's been your constant companion since landing in Iceland simply stops. It's still blowing above you over the grass-covered roof, but down here, you're insulated from it. The acoustic quality changes entirely. Sounds become intimate, immediate. Someone speaks, and their voice doesn't have to compete with wind or waves. It simply exists in the space between walls. The third thing, and perhaps the most important, is warmth, not intense heat. No blast of hot air, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seeps into your cold, stiffened body like a blessing. You've been cold for so long that you'd forgotten what true warmth feels like. Now it surrounds you, rises from the stone floor, radiates from the walls, descends from the roof. Let your eyes adjust. Details emerge from the darkness. You're standing in a single long room, perhaps 20 meters in length and 5 meters wide. The floor is stone flat pieces of basalt, fitted together with remarkable precision. The walls curve slightly inward as they rise, then meet the roof beams overhead. And along both long walls run raised platforms, benches made from stone or earth, covered with layers of sheepskin and woven blankets. These platforms are your beds. During the day, they serve as seats. At night, everyone sleeps here, arranged in order of status and family relationship. The head of the household sleeps in the place of honor, usually at the far end opposite the door. His wife beside him, children nearby, servants and workers along the walls. Everyone close enough to share warmth, positioned so that no one sleeps directly on the cold stone floor. The genius of this arrangement becomes clear as evening deepens. Each sleeping person generates heat, roughly the same as a 100-watt light bulb in modern terms. Multiply that by a household of 20 people, plus the animals on the other side of the wall. and you are generating nearly 3,000 watts of continuous biological heat. In separate beds, in separate rooms, most of that heat is wasted. Here, packed together on shared platforms, everyone becomes part of a collective heating system. Your warmth adds to mine. Mine adds to yours. Together, we create a microclimate that's far warmer than any one of us could maintain alone. And beneath the sleeping platforms, another subtle feature storage. The space below the benches is hollowed out, used to store supplies. This isn't just efficient use of space. It's thermal strategy. Food stored here stays cooler than the main room, but warmer than outside, preventing freezing while inhibiting spoilage. And the food itself, thousands of kilograms of dried fish and grain and cheese, acts as additional thermal mass, something else to absorb heat during the day and release it at night. But the true heart of the thermal system stands at the center of the room. The hearth, not a fireplace in the modern sense, with a chimney and flue. No, this is far more primitive and far more elegant. It's simply a long rectangular pit, perhaps 3 meters long and a meter wide, lined with flat stones and set into the floor so that its top is level with the walking surface. In this pit burns the fire that will never be allowed to go out. Not just for the night, not just for the winter. For years on end, generations, even the fire continues. To let it die would be more than inconvenient. It would be catastrophic. Starting a new fire requires striking steel against flint, coaxing a spark into dried grass, nursing that spark into flame, feeding that flame with the most precious of all resources, dry fuel. Better to keep the fire alive, banking it at night with ash to slow its consumption, feeding it carefully throughout the day. The fuel itself tells a story of adaptation. Wood is too scarce to burn freely. Instead, the primary fuel is peat, called mor in Old Norse. Like turf, peat is cut from bogs, but it comes from deeper layers where plant matter has partially decomposed into a dense black carbon-rich substance. When dried, it burns slowly and steadily, producing more ash than flame, more ember than blaze. Peat doesn't burn hot like wood. It smolders. But that's perfect for this application. You don't want a roaring fire that quickly exhausts your fuel supply. You want a steady, reliable source of heat that can be maintained with minimal effort. Peat provides exactly that. Other materials supplement the peat. Dried sheep dung burns surprisingly well and produces decent heat. Driftwood scraps pieces too small for construction get saved for fire. Animal fat bones, anything that contains energy, gets carefully preserved for burning. Nothing is wasted. The smoke from this fire rises slowly, filling the upper portion of the room with a hazy layer that hangs perhaps a meter below the roof beams. This isn't considered a problem. It's expected, even valued. The smoke helps preserve the wooden beams, coating them with creosote that prevents rot and deters insects. It cures meat hanging from the rafters. It even has antimicrobial properties that help keep the interior space healthier. Eventually, the smoke finds its way out through a small opening in the roof, a gap that can be covered with a piece of wood or hide in truly severe weather. This opening, called a liori, serves multiple purposes. It releases smoke. It admits a small amount of light. And crucially, it provides ventilation, allowing fresh air to enter near the floor while stale air and smoke exit above. The heating system then is really 3 systems working in concert. The fire provides direct radiant heat. The stone floor and walls absorb that heat and radiate it back slowly. And the mass of human bodies maintains a baseline warmth that persists even when the fire burns low. Modern thermal imaging of reconstructed turf houses has revealed something remarkable. The temperature gradient is incredibly gentle. Unlike a modern home where temperature can vary dramatically from room to room, or even within a single room, the turf house maintains remarkable uniformity. Stand at any point in the main hall and the temperature will be within a few degrees of any other point. The thick walls and roof have such high thermal mass that they even out variations, creating a stable, consistent environment. At night, this becomes crucial for sleep. Your body has been working hard all day, laboring in cold conditions, burning enormous calories just to stay alive. Now you need rest, deep restorative rest, and the turf house provides exactly the conditions to support it. The temperature is warm enough to prevent shivering, but not so hot that you sweat. The air is slightly humid from people's breath, and the moisture slowly evaporating from the turf walls, preventing the dry throat and nose that comes from winter heating. The darkness is complete once the fire is banked and the lamps extinguished. And the silence, that profound silence, allows you to hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the subtle sounds of family members shifting in sleep nearby. You lie on the sleeping platform, sheepskins soft beneath you, wool blankets heavy above. Someone has placed hot stones from the hearth edge near your feet, wrapped in cloths so they warm but don't burn. The stones will stay warm for hours, radiating heat up through the blankets. Your muscles begin to relax. The tension you've carried since arriving in this harsh land starts to release. Your breathing slows, deepens. The warmth seeps into bones that have been cold for months, and gradually, inevitably, sleep arrives. Not fitful winter sleep interrupted by cold and fear, but deep, nourishing sleep, the sleep of someone who has finally found true shelter. But before that sleep comes, there are tasks. Evening in a turf house follows a rhythm as old as human habitation, a sequence of small rituals that prepare both the house and its inhabitants for the long night ahead. The work begins while daylight still filters weakly through the smoke hole. Someone, usually one of the older children, has been watching the livestock in the attached byre. Yes, the animals live here too, though in a separate section. The turf house is often built in multiple segments. The main hall, where humans gather, the sleeping quarters, sometimes separate, but often the same space, and the byre where sheep, goats, and perhaps a cow shelter from the cold. This arrangement seems strange to modern sensibilities. Animals indoors. But the Vikings understood something we've forgotten. Those animals are heat generators. A cow produces as much heat as 5 adult humans. Sheep might be smaller, but a dozen sheep still contribute significant warmth. Place them in an attached room with a shared wall, and that heat radiates through into the human living space. It's a heating system that feeds itself literally as you care for the animals that keep you warm. The evening feeding happens systematically. Someone brings armloads of dried hay from the storage area beneath the sleeping platforms. The sheep gather their wool thick with winter growth and munch contentedly. Their body heat rises, warming the floor of the human quarters above. Their breathing adds humidity to the air. Even their waste, while unpleasant, generates a small amount of heat as it decomposes. In the main hall, another person tends the fire. This is a position of The firekeeper adds fresh peat blocks to the hearth, positions them carefully to maintain even heat. They use a long iron poker to arrange the coals, ensuring good airflow. Too much air and the peat burns too quickly. Too little and it smothers. The goal is a steady state that will last through the night with minimal intervention. Water management is crucial. Someone checks the water barrel near the door. In summer, this barrel is refilled from a nearby stream. In winter, it's filled with snow that melts slowly in the room's warmth. Staying hydrated in these conditions is more challenging than you'd expect. The air is dry from the fire. The cold itself seems to desiccate you. Everyone needs to drink regularly, especially the children and elderly who are more vulnerable to dehydration. Food preparation for the next day happens now. Tomorrow's bread is mixed and set near the hearth to rise slowly overnight. Dried fish is inspected. Pieces that need additional drying are moved closer to the smoke layer. Grain is ground on a hand mill, a laborious process that fills the hall with the wholesome smell of fresh flour. A pot of porridge is set at the hearth edge, where it will simmer gently until morning oats, absorbing water and softening into something warm and sustaining for breakfast. Clothing maintenance never stops. Someone sits near the best light mending a torn tunic. Wool is precious. A single sheep produces only so much fleece per year. Every garment is worn until it literally falls apart. Then the wool is reclaimed and respun. The mending is meticulous, tiny stitches that will hold for another season, another year. Nearby, someone else is carding raw wool, combing it between two paddle-shaped tools covered in metal teeth. The wool gradually aligns into fluffy clouds ready for spinning. Meanwhile, the tools of daily life receive attention. A man sits with his axe, running a whetstone along its edge with practiced strokes. The rhythmic scraping sound becomes part of the evening's soundtrack. The axe isn't a weapon here. It's the most important tool anyone owns. It splits firewood, butchers, animals, shapes, timber, serves 1,000 purposes. Keeping it sharp is keeping your family alive. Someone else is working on shoes. Footwear in this climate wears out quickly. Water-cold, rough volcanic rock all conspire to destroy leather. The shoes being repaired are simple things, essentially leather bags that tie around the ankle and are stuffed with dried grass for insulation. They'll last perhaps 2 months of daily wear before needing replacement. But leather is expensive, so every shoe gets repaired multiple times before being retired. The children have their own tasks. The youngest ones are learning to spin wool, their small hands working a drop spindle with varying degrees of success. Their thread is lumpy, uneven, but it improves each day. No one scolds them for imperfection. They're learning, and learning takes time. The older children help with more demanding work, but even they aren't pushed too hard. Tomorrow brings another full day of labor. Tonight is for gentler activities. As full darkness settles outside, someone lights the seal oil lamps. These are simple devices, just soapstone bowls, filled with rendered seal fat with a twisted wool wick floating in the liquid. The light they provide is minimal, a small flame that flickers in the still air. But even that small flame is precious. It extends the usable day by a few hours, allows for continued work, provides a focal point for the family to gather around. Stories begin to flow as hands stay busy. An older man recounts a journey he made years ago to Norway. His voice is slow measured, painting pictures with words. He describes forests so thick you could walk for days without seeing the sky. trees as thick around as 3 men with their arms linked. Bears and wolves that would never be found on this treeless island. The younger people listen with wonder. Most have never seen a real forest. The concept is almost mythical to them. Someone else contributes a saga, one of the long epic poems that preserve history and legend in equal measure. The story might be about Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, or the tragedy of the Volsungs, or the more recent history of Harald Fairhair who united Norway. The words flow in alliterative verse, half sung, half spoken. Everyone knows these stories, but hearing them again never grows old. They're entertainment, yes, but also identity. They connect these isolated settlers to a wider world, a longer history, a tradition that stretches back generations. The women sometimes sing while they work. Not performances, just quiet songs that help pass the time. Work songs that match the rhythm of carding or spinning. Lullabies that soothe restless children. Ballads about love and loss that bring tears to eyes grown hard from survival. The songs are as much a part of the home's warmth as the fire, as much a source of comfort as the thick walls. Gradually, the activity slows. One by one, people finish their tasks. Tools are set aside, carefully placed where they can be found tomorrow. The spinning wheel stops its gentle whir. The whetstone makes its final stroke. The mending is folded and put away. Children are sent to the privy, a small attached room, even colder than outside, where they hurry through necessary business before rushing back to warmth. The firekeeper makes final adjustments to the hearth. The peat is rearranged into a compact pile covered partially with ash to slow its burning through the night. A few larger pieces are positioned where they'll catch if the fire burns low, ensuring it won't go out completely. The water barrel is checked one last time. The door is secured, its leather hinges adjusted, its wooden latch dropped into place. People begin to settle onto the sleeping platforms. The furs and blankets are distributed according to need. Children get extra covering. The elderly get positioned closest to the hearth. Everyone removes their outer layers, the heavy wool tunics and leather overtunics, keeping only underlayers for sleeping. The outer clothes are folded and placed where they'll serve as additional pillows, or can be quickly donned if an emergency arises in the night. There's a final ritual before sleep. Someone, usually the head of household, speaks a few words. Sometimes it's a prayer to the old gods, Thor who controls the weather, Freya who governs harvests, Frigg who watches over hearth and home. Sometimes, in more recent years, after Christianity has arrived, it's a prayer to the new god asking for protection through the night. The words don't matter as much as the act. It's an acknowledgement that survival is never guaranteed, that another day lived is something to be grateful for. The seal oil lamps are extinguished one by one. The darkness deepens. Now only the faint red glow of the hearth remains, painting the room in shades of ember and shadow. The smoke hangs in its layer overhead, invisible now but present. The slight smell of it, combined with the smell of wool and bodies and animals and peat, creates a scent that's entirely unique to these spaces. Not unpleasant, just human, lived in. Breathing slows around the room. The rustling of people settling into their spots gradually ceases. Small sounds persist. A child murmurs in early dreams. A dog sighs, having found its spot near the hearth. The fire itself makes tiny crackling sounds as pockets of moisture in the peat heat and pop. The wind outside rises and falls, but it's distant now, something happening to a world you've temporarily left behind. Someone starts to snore softly. It should be annoying, but somehow it's comforting. It means everyone is safe. Everyone is here. The snoring becomes part of the background texture of sound, joining the fire and the wind, and the quiet breathing of a dozen people, all slowly descending towards sleep. This is community at its most fundamental. Not a philosophical concept, but a physical reality. You cannot survive the brutal winters alone. You can only do it together, sharing space and warmth and resources. The turf house doesn't just shelter bodies. It creates interdependence. Forces cooperation breaks down the barriers that more comfortable circumstances might maintain. You lie on your portion of the sleeping platform, your children on one side, your neighbor's family on the other. The warmth is palpable. It rises from the stone floor, radiates from the walls, descends from the people on either side. You think about tomorrow. There will be work, endless work, livestock to tend, water to fetch, food to prepare, repairs to make. The work never ends. But for now, you let it go. You release the tension. You allow the warmth to sink deeper. Your muscles go slack. Your thoughts begin to drift, becoming less linear, more dreamlike. You're aware of the space around you, but it feels distant, abstracted. The boundary between waking and sleeping blurs. And then you're across it. Sleep has arrived without announcement. Your breathing deepens into the slow rhythm of real rest. Your body temperature drops slightly as your metabolism slows. The turf house continues its patient work, maintaining the perfect environment, keeping you safe from a world that would kill you in hours if these walls didn't stand between you and infinity. The first winter is when the true nature of this place reveals itself. You thought you understood cold, having survived Norwegian winters. You were wrong. Those winters had rhythm, predictable cycles of light and dark. These winters follow different rules entirely. It begins in October when the days start shrinking at an alarming rate. Each sunset comes noticeably earlier than the last. By November, daylight has become a precious commodity, something to be hoarded and cherished. The sun no longer climbs high, but scrapes along the southern horizon like a wheel trying to roll uphill. December arrives, and the sun barely makes an appearance at all, just a faint glow on the horizon for a few hours before retreating. And then comes the solstice, the shortest day when darkness holds dominion for all but 3 or 4 hours. After that, the days should lengthen, and technically they do. But so gradually that you can't perceive the change from day to day. It's not until late February that you'll really notice the light returning, really feel the balance shifting back towards something that feels survivable. This extended darkness does something to the human mind. It's not immediate. The first weeks are almost novel. You've never experienced anything like this. It's interesting in a way. But as week follows week, month follows month, the darkness starts to weigh on you. It becomes an almost physical presence, a pressure, a heaviness. The worst of it isn't the absence of light itself. It's what that absence does to your sense of time. Day and night lose meaning when there's darkness, 18 hours out of 24. Your sleep becomes fragmented. You wake not knowing if it's midnight or near morning. Your body's natural rhythms, calibrated over a lifetime to respond to sunlight, become confused. Some people sleep too much, 16 or 18 hours at a stretch, their bodies trying to hibernate like bears. Others suffer terrible insomnia, lying awake for hours, staring into darkness so complete they can't see their own hands. The psychological term for this wouldn't be coined for another 1,000 years, but you're experiencing it nonetheless. Seasonal affective disorder, depression brought on by lack of light. Your mood darkens with the sky. Tasks that seemed manageable in summer now feel overwhelming. Irritability increases. Small disputes become bitter arguments. The confines of the turf house, so cozy at first, begin to feel like a prison. But the Vikings have developed coping mechanisms, cultural practices, specifically designed to preserve mental health through these long, dark months. These aren't formalized therapies. No one thinks of them that way, but they work nonetheless. First is the absolute prohibition against major disputes. In summer, if two people clash seriously, one can leave, can build their own dwelling, can create distance. In winter, that's impossible. To be cast out is death. So conflicts must be resolved, or at least set aside. The culture develops elaborate systems for mediation, for saving face, for letting grudges cool before they explode into violence. Second is storytelling, which serves purposes beyond mere entertainment. Those long saga recitations, the endless retelling of mythological cycles, these aren't just ways to pass time. They're a form of cognitive therapy. The stories provide structure to shapeless days. They offer heroes to emulate villains, to condemn moral lessons to internalize. They remind people that hardship is temporary, that spring always follows winter, that survival is possible because others have survived before. Third is work, but not excessive work. Everyone has tasks, but no one is pushed to the point of exhaustion. The work is apportioned carefully, ensuring that everyone contributes, but no one breaks. And the work is varied. You don't do the same task for hours on end. You rotate. Card wool for a while, then mend clothes, then help with cooking, then sharpen tools. The variety keeps the mind engaged, prevents the deadly monotony that leads to despair. Fourth, and perhaps most important, is the fire. The hearth becomes more than a heat source. It becomes a focal point for the community's psychological health. People gather around it, not just for warmth, but for the light, for the movement of the flames, for the ancient hypnotic quality that fire has always had for human beings. Staring into those embers, watching them shift and glow, something in the nervous system calms. The autonomic system downregulates. Cortisol levels drop. It's therapy without anyone realizing it. Some nights, especially the longest, darkest nights around the solstice, the hearth becomes the setting for more formalized gatherings. These are the nights for the best stories, the longest sagas, the most cherished songs. Sometimes there's a bit of precious mead to share, honey wine made from last summer's harvest. Not enough to get drunk, just enough to take the edge off, to add a glow of warmth and fellowship to the evening. The drink is passed in a ceremonial horn, each person taking a small sip before passing it along. The youngest children are allowed a taste, just enough to coat their tongue, teaching them the forms. And with each sip comes a moment to speak, to share a thought, a memory, a wish for the season ahead. These aren't grand speeches, just simple words, but they weave the community tighter, remind everyone that they're in this together, that no one survives alone. Religious observance intensifies during these months as well. In the earlier period before Christianity's arrival, midwinter brings the celebration of Yule, 12 days of feasting and sacrifice, designed to honor the gods and ensure the sun's return. Oaths are sworn. Promises are made to the deities. Animals are sacrificed, and their blood sprinkled on the assembly, a visceral reminder of life's fragility and the necessity of divine favor. After Christianization, the rituals change, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Christmas serves the same function Yule once did. It provides a fixed point in the darkness, something to look forward to, a reason to believe that the worst will eventually pass. The prayers change from Thor and Odin to Christ and Mary, but the need they address is identical human beings in darkness reaching towards something beyond themselves for comfort and hope. There are harder nights, nights when the wind screams with such fury that even inside the turf house you feel its vibration. Nights when the cold penetrates despite the thick walls, when the fire seems inadequate, when frost forms on the interior surface of the door. These are the nights that test faith and resolve. On such nights, the oldest member of the household might tell a story about an ancestor who survived something even worse. A grandfather who weathered the terrible winter of 3 decades past when snowdrifts rose higher than the roof and food ran out before spring. Or a grandmother who kept her family alive after her husband died at sea, managing the household alone through season after season of hardship. These stories serve a specific purpose. They establish a lineage of survival. They prove that what feels impossible has been done before. They transform the current suffering from something unique and unbearable into something that's part of a larger pattern, something that can be endured because others endured it. Children especially need this psychological framework. They're experiencing their first real Icelandic winter, and it terrifies them. The darkness seems endless. The cold feels like a living enemy. They have nightmares about freezing, about being lost in blizzards, about the house collapsing and burying them in snow. The adults know these fears are rational, rooted in actual danger, so they don't dismiss them. Instead, they contextualize them. A mother might hold a frightened child close and speak softly about the house itself, about how its walls have stood for generations, about how the builders knew what they were doing, about how thousands of people are sleeping safely tonight in houses just like this one across Iceland. She doesn't lie and say there's no danger, but she frames the danger as manageable, as something that can be survived with proper precautions. A father might take his son outside briefly during a clear night, letting him see the stars in their astonishing brightness, unpolluted by any artificial light. The cold is brutal, and they don't stay long. But in those moments, the father can point to the constellations, tell their stories, explain how sailors have navigated by these same stars for centuries. The message is subtle, but clear. The world is ordered. It follows patterns. Even in darkness and cold, there's structure, meaning the possibility of understanding. The psychological resilience required to survive brutal winters isn't something you're born with. It's something you develop day by day, night by night, through practices and rituals and the support of others. And the turf house, far from being just a physical shelter, becomes part of that psychological infrastructure. Its thick walls don't just keep out cold. They create a bounded space, a known territory, a place where the terrifying infinity of the winter landscape is reduced to comprehensible dimensions. You can cross this room in a dozen steps. You know every person in it. You can reach out in the darkness and touch the wall, feel its solidity, its permanence. These simple facts provide an anchor when the mind begins to spiral into fear. You're not lost in vastness. You're here in this specific place, surrounded by these specific people. The world might be hostile, but this pocket of it is controlled, maintained, held against the chaos outside. As the weeks pass, you adjust. The darkness that seemed so oppressive becomes normal. Your eyes adapt, learning to see by firelight, by the faint glow of seal oil lamps, by starlight on snow when you must venture outside. Your sleep pattern settles into something functional, if not ideal. Your mood stabilizes as you accept that this is simply how life is. For now that fighting it mentally is exhausting, that acceptance brings a kind of peace. And occasionally, as if to reward that acceptance, the darkness offers gifts. The aurora borealis, the northern lights painting the sky in ribbons of green and red and purple. No one understands what causes them. They seem like messages from the gods, or perhaps the gods themselves dancing above the world. People stand outside in bitter cold necks, craned back watching the lights ripple and flow. For those moments, the darkness becomes not an enemy, but a canvas, a backdrop against which beauty can appear. Or the moon rising full and enormous over the ice, bright enough to cast shadows, turning the snow-covered landscape into something from a dream. On such nights, you can travel safely, can check the livestock in their shelter, can even do limited work outside. The moonlight feels like a blessing, a reminder that darkness and light are not opposites, but partners, each necessary, each with its place. By the time winter's depth finally breaks, by the time you can see the days lengthening perceptibly, by the time the sun begins to arc higher and stay longer, you've been transformed. You're not the same person who entered this season. You've learned things about yourself, about your capacity to endure, about what really matters when everything else is stripped away. You've survived not just physical hardship, but psychological trial. And that survival brings a quiet pride, a confidence that will never fully leave you. You've proven something fundamental. You're strong enough. You can endure. To understand these houses fully, we need to step back and examine why anyone came to Iceland in the first place. The story begins not with adventure, but with politics. In the 860s and 870s, Norway was changing. For centuries, it had been a loose collection of small kingdoms, petty chieftains controlling valleys and fjords, sometimes cooperating, more often feuding. Then came Harald Fairhair, a king with ambitions beyond his region. Through a combination of military force and strategic marriage, Harald began unifying Norway under single rule. For the common farmer, for the small landowner, Harald's unification was catastrophic. It meant centralized taxation. It meant kowtowing to a distant king. It meant loss of the independence that had defined Norse culture. Many free farmers found themselves reduced to tenant status on lands their families had owned for generations. Others were forced into military service for a king they'd never chosen. The response was emigration. If you had a ship or could buy passage on one, you left. The first wave went to the Scottish Islands, Shetland and Orkney, which were sparsely populated and offered good farmland. But those islands filled quickly. The second wave pushed farther to the Faroe Islands, tiny specks of land in the North Atlantic. But even these had limited capacity. Then came word of Iceland. Irish monks had been living there seasonally for perhaps a century, using it as a hermitage for summer retreats. But they'd never settled permanently, never brought families or livestock. To them, Iceland was a spiritual destination. To the Norse, it represented something more practical: empty land, unclaimed territory, a place where a man could build without asking permission from king or chieftain. The first permanent settler is traditionally named as Ingolfur Arnason, who arrived in 874. The saga says he threw his high-seat pillars overboard as he approached the coast, then built his farm wherever the pillars washed ashore, trusting the gods to guide him to the right spot. Whether that story is literally true matters less than what it represents: a willingness to let go of control, to adapt to what the land offers, rather than imposing preconceived plans. Ingolfur was followed by hundreds, then thousands. The settlement period, roughly 870 to 930, saw Iceland's population explode from 0 to perhaps 40 or 50,000. Entire extended families made the journey. They brought everything they could carry: tools, livestock, seed grain, household goods. Some even brought timber, disassembling their Norwegian houses and bringing the wood to rebuild on new shores. But when they arrived, the reality proved harsher than imagination had painted it. Iceland has only about 30% forest cover, and what exists are scrubby birch and willow, not the tall, straight timber suitable for construction. The settlers had expected to find resources similar to Norway's. Instead, they found a landscape that demanded completely new approaches. The initial response was denial. People tried to build Norwegian-style longhouses using what timber they could find. These structures failed spectacularly. They were drafty, inadequate to the climate, and they consumed the already scarce wood at an unsustainable rate. Within just 60 years of human arrival, that forest cover collapsed from 30% to less than 1%, cut down by people who hadn't yet learned to conserve. The shift to turf architecture represents a profound cultural adaptation. It meant abandoning methods that had served Norse people for centuries. It meant admitting that the old ways wouldn't work here, that success required humility and innovation. For a culture that prided itself on tradition, on doing things the way ancestors had done them, this was a psychological barrier, as significant as any physical challenge. But necessity is uncompromising. People who clung to wooden construction froze. Their buildings collapsed under snow. They ran out of firewood and couldn't rebuild. The survivors were those willing to experiment, to learn from each other, to develop entirely new building traditions. The turf house didn't emerge fully formed. It evolved through trial and error, through disasters and small breakthroughs, through the kind of collective problem-solving that happens when everyone faces the same crisis simultaneously. Different builders tried different techniques. Some worked, some failed. The successful methods spread shared from farm to farm, valley to valley, until a stable design emerged. By the year 1000, when Iceland officially converted to Christianity, the turf house had become standard. It wasn't just a building type. It was a statement about Icelandic identity. Unlike Norway with its great wooden halls, unlike Denmark with its fortified settlements, Iceland had developed something unique, something that arose directly from its landscape's constraints and possibilities. The houses varied in size and complexity depending on wealth and status. A poor farmer might have a simple single-room structure, perhaps 6 meters long with minimal interior division. A wealthy chieftain might build a complex with multiple interconnected buildings, a large hall for gatherings, separate sleeping quarters, storage buildings, workshops, all linked by covered passages, so you could move between them without going outside. The saga literature preserves descriptions of some famous halls. Njal's house at Bergthorshvoll appears in Njal's saga as a large complex with specific architectural details that archaeologists have verified through excavation. The turf walls, the layout, even the dimensions match what the saga describes. Similarly, the sagas mention Egil Skallagrimsson's hall at Borg, another verified archaeological site. These weren't modest dwellings. The largest could accommodate 50 or 60 people comfortably, with room for twice that during gatherings. They were centers of political power places where disputes were mediated, where alliances were forged, where the mechanisms of governance took shape. Iceland, uniquely among medieval societies, had no king. Instead, it developed a commonwealth system where chieftains held power through consensus and negotiation. The Turf House Hall was where that negotiation happened. But even in wealthy establishments, the basic principles remained the same. Thick walls, semi-subterranean construction, central hearth, communal sleeping arrangements. The architecture enforced egalitarianism in ways that Norwegian class structure did not. When everyone sleeps in the same room, when the chieftain's family is only a few meters from the workers' rigid hierarchy, becomes difficult to maintain. This had long-term cultural effects. Icelandic society, while certainly stratified by wealth and status, never developed the feudal rigidity that characterized continental Europe. The poorest farmer might petition the richest chieftain, directly might speak at the Althing. The National Assembly might have his grievances heard and addressed. The architecture of daily life, the physical intimacy enforced by the turf house, created social structures that were more flexible, more democratic in practice, if not in theory. The settlement also spread beyond Iceland. Norse settlers reached Greenland around 985, under Eric the Red, driven there by the same motivations that had driven people to Iceland: land hunger, legal troubles, restless ambition. Greenland proved even harsher than Iceland, with even less vegetation, shorter growing seasons, more extreme cold. But the turf house technology transferred successfully. Excavations of Norse Greenland sites show houses almost identical to Icelandic examples, proof that the design was robust enough to function across a range of extreme environments. For a while, the Greenland settlements thrived. At their peak, around 1200, perhaps 5,000 people lived across two main settlement areas on Greenland's west coast. They traded walrus ivory and furs to Europe in exchange for iron timber and luxury goods. They built churches, including a cathedral at Gardar, that rivaled anything in Iceland. And through it all, they lived in turf houses that sheltered them from cold, that made Iceland seem mild by comparison. But Greenland also demonstrates the limits of adaptation. Around 1300, the climate began to worsen. The medieval warm period, which had made Norse settlement possible, ended. The Little Ice Age began. Growing seasons shortened. Sea ice expanded, making navigation treacherous. The supply ships from Europe came less frequently, then stopped entirely. The Greenland Norse found themselves isolated, cut off from the trade networks that supplied crucial resources like iron. By 1450, the settlements were abandoned. What happened to the people remains debated. Some may have died from starvation or disease. Some may have been absorbed into Inuit populations who were better adapted to the changing conditions. Some may have managed to book passage on the rare ship that still made the journey. The archaeological record shows houses left intact doors, closed, suggesting people intended to return and never did. Iceland, by contrast, survived. It survived the Little Ice Age, though not without tremendous suffering. It survived the Black Death, which arrived in 1402 and killed perhaps half the population. It survived volcanic eruptions, including the catastrophic Laki eruption of 1783 that produced toxic fog, killed most of the livestock, and led to famine that killed a quarter of the remaining population. Through all this, the turf houses endured, sheltering the survivors, maintaining the population through crisis after crisis. The architectural tradition continued for centuries longer than anyone might have predicted. Even after Iceland came under Norwegian and later Danish rule, even after timber became available through trade, many Icelanders preferred their turf houses. They knew these structures, they trusted them, and honestly, they worked better than wooden houses in Icelandic conditions. The imported wood rotted quickly in the damp climate unless meticulously maintained. Turf, by contrast, could be replaced easily using materials right at hand. It wasn't until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that turf houses finally began to disappear. Corrugated iron imported from Britain offered a new building material that was durable, reasonably insulated, and relatively affordable. Concrete followed. By 1950, turf houses were becoming rare. By 1970, they'd virtually vanished as primary residences. But they haven't been forgotten. Several have been preserved as museums maintained by the Icelandic government and UNESCO as cultural heritage sites. At places like Glaumber and Keldur, you can walk through reconstructed turf houses, see the sleeping platforms stand in the central hall. Try to imagine life as it was lived for 1,000 years. The Icelandic government has even nominated the turf house tradition for UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage status, recognizing it as a crucial part of the nation's identity and history. And occasionally, someone builds a new one. Not as a primary residence, usually, but as a summer house or artist's retreat. They discover what the original settlers knew. There's something profoundly peaceful about being surrounded by earth, about living in a house that breathes, that feels alive, that connects you to the ground beneath your feet in ways that modern construction never can. Iceland's turf houses weren't unique in using earth as a primary building material. Across the Arctic and subarctic regions, multiple cultures independently developed similar solutions to similar problems. Examining these parallel developments reveals something profound about human ingenuity and the constraints that shape it. The Inuit of northern Canada and Greenland famously built igloos, dome-shaped structures made from blocks of compacted snow. At first glance, these seem entirely different from turf houses, but the underlying principles are nearly identical. Both use locally abundant materials with excellent insulating properties. Both employ mass rather than framework as the primary structural element. Both create spaces partially protected by the earth or snow around them. And both rely on the thermal properties of their materials to maintain livable interior temperatures. An igloo, properly constructed, can maintain interior temperatures around 0 Celsius, even when the outside temperature plummets to 40 below. The snow itself, like turf, is full of trapped air pockets, and the dome shape is structurally efficient, distributing weight evenly, so no single point bears excessive load. The Inuit didn't have access to iron tools or timber. They worked with what they had: snow, ice bone, and animal skins. Yet they created homes that functioned superbly in conditions that would kill an unprepared person in hours. The difference between igloos and turf houses lies mainly in permanence. Igloos were typically temporary structures built for winter hunting camps and abandoned in spring when they melted. Turf houses were year-round dwellings meant to last decades. This reflects different subsistence strategies. The Inuit were primarily hunter-gatherers who followed animal migrations. The Norse were farmers and herders who stayed in one place. But both cultures understood the same fundamental principle: work with your environment rather than against it. Further south, on the Great Plains of North America, various indigenous peoples developed the Earth Lodge, particularly the Mandan Hidatsa and Arikara tribes. These structures bear striking similarities to turf houses. They're circular or octagonal buildings, partially underground, with a framework of timber covered by layers of willow branches and then thick earth. Interior space centers around a fire pit. Multiple families often shared one lodge. The larger examples could house 30 or 40 people. The construction technique differs in details, but matches in concept. Posts and beams create a structural skeleton. Lighter materials form an initial covering. Then earth is piled on top, sometimes to depths of a meter or more. The result is a dwelling that stays cool in the brutal plains summer and warm in the frigid winter. Like turf houses, earth lodges were occupied for many years, with maintenance consisting mainly of adding fresh earth to the roof as the older layers decomposed. These earth lodges disappeared even more thoroughly than turf houses. By the late 1800s, forced relocation to reservations and pressure to adopt European-style frame houses meant the tradition died out. But archaeological excavations have revealed the extent of historical earth lodge villages. Some sites show evidence of hundreds of lodges clustered together, creating substantial towns that sustained populations for centuries. In the American Southwest, different constraints produced different earthen architecture. The ancestral Puebloans built elaborate cliff dwellings and freestanding pueblos, using adobe, a mixture of clay soil water and organic material. These structures often rose multiple stories, creating apartment-like complexes that housed entire communities. The thick adobe walls provided thermal mass, staying cool during scorching days and releasing stored heat during cold nights. Adobe architecture continues to this day in the Southwest, proving that earthen building isn't inherently primitive or temporary. Modern adobe houses built with techniques refined over centuries are highly energy efficient, durable, and aesthetically beautiful. They demonstrate that working with earth rather than against it remains viable even in an age of industrial materials. In the Middle East, particularly in Yemen and parts of Iran, multi-story mud brick towers have stood for centuries. These buildings can rise 4, 5, even 6 stories high, built entirely from sun-dried mud bricks with minimal timber reinforcement. They house extended families with lower floors for animals and storage middle floors for daily living, and upper floors as secure sleeping quarters and defensive positions. The mud walls, often a meter thick at the base, provide insulation in a climate of temperature extremes. What ties all these traditions together is not shared cultural contact. The Norse settlers in Iceland had no knowledge of Mandan earth lodges or Yemeni mud towers. These solutions emerged independently because the problems were universal and the physics were immutable. If you need shelter in extreme climates and lack abundant timber or stone, you use earth. And if you use earth intelligently, understanding its properties and working with its strengths, you can create homes that are comfortable, durable, and remarkably sophisticated. Modern architectural research has begun to appreciate what traditional builders always knew. Earthen architecture has thermal mass that regulates temperature. It has humidity buffering capacity that maintains comfortable interior atmospheres. It uses local materials, reducing transportation energy. It's relatively simple to construct and repair using readily available resources. And at end of life, it decomposes harmlessly, unlike concrete or steel or plastic composites that persist as pollutants for centuries. There's growing interest in contemporary earthen building, particularly in sustainable architecture circles. Rammed earth, where slightly damp soil is compressed between forms to create solid walls, is being used in high-end residential and commercial projects. Compressed earth blocks, essentially modern adobe, offer the thermal benefits of earthen construction with the convenience of standardized units. Even living roofs covered with soil and plants echo the turf house principle of using vegetation as insulation and waterproofing. The Viking turf house, then, isn't just a historical curiosity. It's part of a global tradition of earthen building that represents some of humanity's oldest and potentially most sustainable architectural knowledge. These buildings arise from deep understanding of materials and climate, from generational accumulation of practical wisdom, from the kind of knowing that comes not from books, but from lived experience passed parent to child for centuries. In Iceland, this knowledge remained active far longer than in most other places. While Europe was building in stone and brick and timber, while industrialization was introducing steel and concrete and glass, Iceland continued building with turf into the 20th century. This wasn't backwardness, it was pragmatism. Turf worked. It was available. It was affordable, and it was beautiful in its own right, creating houses that blended seamlessly with the landscape that seemed to grow from the earth rather than being imposed upon it. The last generation to grow up in turf houses is now mostly gone. The direct transmission of building knowledge has been broken, but the houses themselves remain either as preserved museums or as ruins slowly melting back into the hillsides from which they came. And increasingly, people are studying them, not as relics, but as potential models, asking what this ancient tradition might teach us about building sustainably, about living in harmony with rather than in opposition to our environments. Let's return to the interior, to the lived experience of social life within these earthen walls. Because the turf house wasn't just a physical structure, it was a social technology that shaped relationships and reinforced values in ways both subtle and profound. Sleep in a turf house was never a private affair. The sleeping platforms running along both walls created a communal bedroom where everyone bedded down within arm's reach of someone else. This arrangement was partly practical, a matter of maximizing warmth and efficiently using limited space. But it also reflected and reinforced cultural values about community, family, and social obligation. The sleeping order followed careful protocols. The head of household and his wife occupied the place of honor, usually at the far end of the hall opposite the door. This position was warmest, being farthest from the entrance, where cold air entered, and closest to the hearth's permanent warmth. It also carried symbolic weight. The high seat from which the master presided during waking hours was often built into this section of the sleeping platform, transforming from throne to bed depending on time of day. The couple's unmarried children slept nearby, arranged by age with the youngest closest to the parents. This provided practical supervision, keeping small children from wandering in the night, preventing accidents near the hearth. It also maintained family cohesion, ensuring that even in sleep, the family unit remained intact and recognizable. Married sons and their families occupied adjacent sections of the platforms. Unmarried adult sons slept on the opposite side of the hall, where they could rise quickly if trouble threatened, and where their youthful energy could endure slightly cooler temperatures. Daughters who'd married typically moved to their husband's household, but widowed daughters, or those whose marriages had failed, might return occupying spaces near their parents. Household workers, servants and slaves slept at the peripheries nearest the door or in secondary rooms if the house had them. This wasn't just about status, it was about security. The most expendable members of the household slept where threats would arrive, first providing early warning if enemies or wild animals approached. It was a brutal calculus that made perfect sense in a world where violence was always possible. But here's what's less obvious. This sleeping arrangement created intimacy across class lines that was unusual for medieval society. The worker sleeping 5 meters from the master couldn't be entirely dehumanized. His snoring woke the household. His children cried in the night and were soothed by the master's wife. When he fell ill, everyone knew, because everyone heard his coughing. Cruelty became more difficult when its consequences were so immediate and unavoidable. The Icelandic sagas reflect this unusual social flexibility. Heroes in these stories often rise from humble backgrounds. Grettir, the strong, arguably Iceland's most famous outlaw, begins life as a difficult child in a fairly ordinary family. Egil Skallagrimsson, though eventually a landowner and chieftain, spends parts of his life as a mercenary and social outcast. The stories don't treat social position as entirely fixed. They allow for movement for individuals to rise or fall based on their actions. This social mobility had architectural roots. When everyone sleeps in the same room, when the chieftain's sons are friends with the servants' sons, because they've grown up literally alongside each other, rigid caste systems become difficult to maintain. There's shared humanity that can't be denied when you've heard someone else's nightmares, when you've shared warmth on the coldest nights, when you've weathered crises together in close quarters. Gender dynamics also played out within this space, though, in ways that seem contradictory to modern perspectives. Women's work centered on the household interior. Spinning, weaving, cooking, childcare, these were female domains. And since the turf house was the household center, women held considerable authority within it. The wife managed the home's daily operations, directed servants, allocated resources, made decisions about food preparation and storage. But women's authority was circumscribed. They rarely spoke in legal assemblies. They couldn't serve as chieftains or temple priests. Property passed through male lines. A woman's status derived largely from her husband's position. The turf house, for all the authority it granted women within its walls, also confined them to those walls in ways that men experienced less acutely. Yet there are hints of something more complex. The sagas preserve numerous examples of women exercising real power, often precisely because they controlled household resources. A wife could make her husband's political ambitions impossible by withholding support. She could build or destroy alliances through her hospitality or lack thereof. The spindle and loom weren't just tools, they were sources of wealth. Wool and woven cloth were currency. A skilled weaver could produce trade goods that enriched the entire household. That gave her leverage, a form of power that operated outside formal legal structures. The communal sleeping arrangement also affected sexuality and intimacy. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Married couples shared beds on platforms surrounded by their children, parents, workers. How did people navigate desire and intimacy in such conditions? The evidence is sparse, but some patterns emerge. First, darkness helped. Once the lamps were extinguished, the hall became quite literally pitch black. Combined with layers of blankets and the background sounds of breathing and snoring, a couple could achieve a degree of privacy through sensory isolation, if not physical separation. Second, social convention enforced a kind of willful blindness. You didn't acknowledge what you might hear or sense happening nearby. It simply wasn't discussed. Third, opportunities for actual privacy did exist, though they required effort. A couple might slip out to a storage building or take advantage of summer evenings when others were working outside, or arrange to be busy with tasks that took them away from the main hall. But this lack of privacy also had benefits. It meant relationships couldn't be easily hidden or lied about. Everyone knew who was coupling with whom. This prevented some abuses. A man couldn't easily coerce a woman when everyone would hear objections. Affairs were difficult to conduct secretly. This created a kind of community oversight that had protective qualities, even as it constrained individual freedom. Children growing up in turf houses absorbed lessons about human nature that we've largely forgotten. They learned that people snore past gas, have nightmares, wake disoriented. They learned that adults are sometimes foolish, that authority figures make mistakes, that perfection is impossible. They learned resilience, how to sleep through disturbances, how to share space without constant conflict, how to cooperate because defection wasn't viable. They also learned practical skills through constant observation. A child sleeping near the hearth watched how fires were tended, absorbed the techniques without formal instruction. Children near the door learned about security, about the sounds that meant someone approaching, about when to sound alarm and when to stay quiet. Children near working women learned textile crafts by watching countless hours of spinning and weaving their hands, itching to try the tools themselves. This educational model depended entirely on proximity. There were no schools, no formal institutions of learning. Knowledge passed through observation and participation. The turf house was classroom, workshop, and home simultaneously. Everything children needed to know to survive and thrive was demonstrated daily by the adults around them. As children grew into adults, they gradually shifted position on the sleeping platforms, moving from the protected center toward the responsible peripheries. An adolescent boy might be moved to the section with unmarried men learning their skills and absorbing their culture. An adolescent girl might take a spot with the women where she'd be trained in household management and textile work. These transitions marked developmental stages, visible to the entire community, acknowledged and supported by all. When death came, and it came often in this harsh environment, it too occurred within the communal space. The sick were kept on their sleeping platform, tended by family and friends. Everyone heard the labored breathing, watched the decline, knew when the end was near. Death wasn't hidden in hospitals or care facilities. It was part of life, witnessed and shared. This meant grief was also communal. When someone died, everyone mourned because everyone had known them intimately. The absence on the sleeping platform was immediately obvious, a gap that would slowly be filled by others shifting position. But the memory remained. People told stories about the deceased, preserving their personality and deeds in oral tradition. The turf house held these memories, its walls having witnessed entire lifetimes from birth through death. Modern peoples sometimes romanticize this closeness while underestimating its costs. Yes, there was community and support and shared warmth, but there was also no escape from difficult relationships, no personal space, no ability to retreat and recover from social stress. If you disliked someone in your household, you still slept within meters of them every night. If you were introverted and needed solitude, you simply didn't get it. The turf house enforced togetherness, whether individuals wanted it or not. Yet, people adapted. They developed psychological strategies for maintaining boundaries, even without physical separation. They learned to create mental privacy, to retreat into thought, even while surrounded by others. They developed social rituals that created predictable patterns, reducing the friction of constant proximity. They found ways to be together without constantly engaging, existing side by side in companionable silence. And there was beauty in it too, the security of knowing you'd never be truly alone. The comfort of familiar breathing surrounding you in darkness. The warmth, physical and emotional, of being part of something larger than yourself. These weren't trivial benefits. They were fundamental human needs met in ways that modern isolated living often fails to provide. Deep into the night now. The fire has burned down to embers, barely glowing, breathing softly like a sleeping animal. The temperature has dropped slightly, but remains comfortable, the massive walls releasing stored heat in a slow tide that will continue until morning. Outside, the wind has quieted, or perhaps you've simply stopped hearing it. The darkness is complete, absolute, the kind of darkness that no longer exists in most of the modern world. You lie on your portion of the sleeping platform, surrounded by your family, your household, your small tribe against the wilderness. Your body has settled deep into the sheepskins and blankets. The slight smell of lanolin mingles with peat smoke and human warmth. Your breathing has synchronized with those around you without conscious effort, everyone drawing breath at roughly the same rhythm, as if the house itself is breathing one great slow lung, expanding and contracting. Your mind drifts thoughts, becoming less structured, more imagistic. You see the volcanic landscape outside, harsh and beautiful, unforgiving, yet somehow accommodating to those who approach it with respect. You think about the house around you, how it's not separate from that landscape, but part of it made from it will return to it someday. Because that's the nature of turf houses. They're not permanent in the way stone castles or concrete buildings are permanent. They require maintenance. Every few years, the outer layers of turf need replacing as weather and time erode them. New blocks are cut and placed covering the old. It's not repair so much as renewal, the house constantly being remade from the same material it's always been. This impermanence worried no one. It was simply understood that buildings, like people, have lifespans. A well-maintained turf house might last 50 years, perhaps a century with devoted care. But eventually, its time would end. The roof would sag, the walls would slump. And rather than fight this inevitable decline, people would simply build anew, often right next to the old house, using its collapsing structure as a source of enriched soil for the new foundation. And when a house was finally abandoned, when a family moved away or died out, when no one remained to maintain the structure, it didn't become an eyesore. It didn't persist as ruins that mar the landscape for centuries. Instead, it gently subsided, melted back into the hillside grass growing over it, wildflowers colonizing its roof birds nesting in the gaps. Within a generation, you could walk past and not realize a house had ever stood there. The land reclaimed what had always been hers. This cycle feels right somehow. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, turf to turf. The house gives shelter during lifetimes, then surrenders itself back to the earth. There's humility in that, an acknowledgement that human works are temporary, that we borrow from the land and must eventually repay. Modern building seems to have lost this understanding. We build as if permanence were possible, as if concrete and steel could truly defeat time. We construct monuments to our own importance, then watch helplessly as they crumble into unsightly ruins that will persist for centuries. The hubris in this approach becomes obvious when you've lived in a turf house, when you've experienced architecture that doesn't pretend to transcend nature, but instead participates in nature's cycles. Your thoughts drift to the people who first built these houses. Those initial settlers stepping off longships onto volcanic shores, terrified and determined in equal measure. You think about the moment when someone first cut turf and stacked it into a wall, testing whether this strange material would hold. The relief when it did. The gratitude they must have felt as they survived their first winter, realizing they'd found a solution that worked. You think about all the people who've slept in houses like this over the centuries. Farmers and fishermen, outlaws and poets, women in childbirth, old people breathing their last, children dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon, each one adding their story to the stones, their warmth to the walls, their life to the continuous thread of human endurance in this difficult place. And you realize you're part of that story now. Your body heat is warming. These walls will be absorbed into the thermal mass, will radiate back to warm tomorrow's occupants. Your breath adds moisture to the air. Your presence adds to the community. Your survival proves again that the system works, that Vikings found a way to survive brutal winters through innovation and adaptation. The word Viking itself takes on new meaning from this perspective. Popular culture envisions Vikings as warriors, raiders, adventurers. And some were, but most were farmers, fishermen, herders. People who wanted land security, a place to raise families. People willing to work incredibly hard in harsh conditions for the simple opportunity to be free to make their own decisions to build something lasting. The turf house embodies that spirit more than any longship or battle axe. It represents not conquest, but adaptation. Not domination, but cooperation with the environment. It's the physical manifestation of a culture that valued independence enough to endure tremendous hardship in pursuit of it. Your breathing slows further, becomes even more regular. You're very close to sleep now, balanced on that delicate edge where consciousness blurs into dream. Images float through your mind without narrative coherence. grass waving in wind, smoke rising in cold air, children laughing, sheep calling to each other, the play of firelight on dark walls. All the sensory fragments of life in this place dissolving into abstraction as sleep approaches. The warmth around you feels almost liquid now, as if you're submerged in something thicker than air, heavier, more supportive. Your body weight seems to distribute into the sleeping platform, becoming less distinct. The boundary between yourself and your surroundings softens, becomes permeable. You're simultaneously yourself and part of the collective body of the household, sharing heat and space and breath with all the others drifting towards sleep around you. Time loses structure. You might be in the year 900 or 1100 or 1800. The experience is fundamentally the same across centuries, because the circumstances are the same human beings finding warmth and safety in earthen walls, surviving together what none could survive alone. You become aware in a distant, dreamy way that you've been part of something much larger than yourself. This house, this method of living, this tradition stretching back over 1,000 years of accumulated wisdom about how to survive in impossible conditions. Every person who contributed to that wisdom, every small innovation and careful observation, every parent teaching a child the proper way to cut turf or tend fire or share warmth, they're all here, somehow present in the very structure that shelters you. The house is more than a building. It's memory made physical. It's the answer to a question that each generation asks anew: how do we survive? And the answer it gives is simple, together with humility, working with what we have rather than mourning what we lack, building shelter that's impermanent, but sufficient, trusting that warmth and community can carry us through the darkest winters. Your thoughts are barely thoughts now, more like impressions, sensations, the feeling of falling very slowly into something soft and dark and welcoming. Sleep is here, has been approaching patiently, and now finally arrives to claim you. In this moment, you understand something that will be forgotten by morning, but is absolutely true. Right now, the greatest human achievements aren't always the grandest or most permanent. Sometimes they're simple things like warm walls made of grass, like communities sharing space and heat, like methods of building that work with nature rather than against it. These humble achievements don't make it into history books. They don't inspire epic poetry or dramatic paintings. But they save lives. They allow survival. They create the conditions under which culture and art and story can flourish. The Vikings who built these houses didn't conquer this land. They made peace with it. They found a way to live here, to raise families here, to thrive here, despite everything the climate could throw at them. And that's its own kind of heroism. The heroism of persistence, of adaptation, of waking each morning and doing the work that survival requires day after day, year after year, generation after generation, until eventually this harsh land becomes home. Until eventually you can't imagine living anywhere else. Until eventually you're part of the landscape as surely as the mountains and the sea. You're asleep now, though you don't know it. The transition happened without announcement, consciousness sliding seamlessly into dream. Your breathing continues its slow rhythm. Your body releases the last held tension. The walls around you continue their patient work, holding back the cold, maintaining the perfect environment for rest and recovery. The fire in the hearth burns down to ash, but doesn't die completely. Deep in its heart, embers glow preserved for morning, ready to be coaxed back to flame when the new day requires warmth again. The house breathes with everyone in it, a living thing made of earth and grass, and the shared warmth of human bodies against the infinite cold outside. Tomorrow will bring work, endless work, the struggle to survive in this unforgiving place. But tonight, there's rest. Tonight, there's warmth. Tonight, there's the profound peace that comes from being sheltered, from being safe, from being part of something that works, that has worked for centuries, that will continue working for centuries more. The snow falls outside, silent and endless, covering the landscape in white. The wind returns, moving across the land, finding no purchase on the smooth grass-covered roof. Inside, everyone sleeps, dreaming their individual dreams while collectively maintaining the warmth that keeps them all alive. This is survival. Not the dramatic kind of sagas and battles, but the real kind. The kind that matters. The kind that allows human life to persist in places that should be uninhabitable. The kind that built a nation from nothing, that created a culture still vital today, that proved humans can adapt to virtually any environment if they're willing to learn, willing to cooperate, willing to humble themselves before nature's power. The turf house stands through the night, as it has stood through countless nights before, as it will stand through countless nights to come, offering its simple gift shelter, warmth, community. Everything necessary, nothing wasted, survival and grace in equal measure. And that's where we'll leave our journey tonight. In that warm darkness, surrounded by earthen walls, part of a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. The Vikings, who built these underground turf houses, faced brutal winters that would have defeated them had they tried to impose their old ways on a new land. Instead, they learned humility. They learned to work with what Iceland offered, rather than fighting for what it couldn't provide. They learned that sometimes the strongest structure isn't the tallest, but the lowest, not the most imposing, but the most invisible, not conquering nature, but surrendering to it. That lesson resonates across centuries. We still face challenges that can't be overcome through force alone. We still need to adapt, to learn to accept that our preconceptions might need adjustment when circumstances demand it. The turf house reminds us that intelligence isn't about imposing our will. It's about observation, about understanding systems, about finding elegant solutions to difficult problems. These houses disappeared from daily life decades ago, replaced by modern construction that's warmer, more convenient, easier to maintain. Progress isn't something to regret, but something was lost too. The intimate connection between dwelling and landscape, the enforced community of shared space, the humility of building something you know is temporary that will return to the earth that provided it. A few turf houses remain preserved as museums maintained against their natural inclination to dissolve back into hillsides. You can visit them, duck through the low door stand in that dimness, try to imagine what it felt like to live there. But imagination can only take you so far. You'd need to spend a winter there, feel the walls' warmth, share sleeping space with a household of people, tend the fire through long dark nights, to really understand. What we can grasp is the broader lesson. That human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation when necessary. That we've survived in every climate on Earth, not because we're the strongest or fastest or best equipped, but because we're clever, because we learn, because we share knowledge across generations. The turf house is just one example among thousands of human ingenuity, meeting environmental challenge and finding solutions. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your own comfortable bed, surrounded by modern insulation and climate control, perhaps spare a thought for those who came before. The settlers who crossed the North Atlantic seeking freedom. The families who endured brutal winters huddled together in darkness. The builders who perfected over centuries the art of making shelter from grass and earth, and the few precious timbers the sea provided. They survived, so their descendants could thrive. They endured so eventually Iceland could become what it is today. And they did it by building houses that were in their own way perfect. Not grand or impressive or designed to last forever. Just sufficient. Just exactly what was needed. Just enough. Thank you for listening tonight. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you found something valuable in this story. I hope your own sleep tonight is warm and peaceful and restorative. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another journey into history. I'm Peter Miller. Until then, sleep well. Let the darkness embrace you as those turf house walls embraced the Vikings who built them. Let your worries settle like snow. Let warmth and safety surround you. Let sleep come gently as it came to those farmers and fishermen and families 1,000 years ago, lying on their platforms, listening to the fire, whisper, feeling the earth's embrace all around them. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful.